Hello, my name is Michael Anderson, and I need you to hear what I'm about to say because it changed my life forever. On April 14th, 2016, I died. I left my body, saw both heaven and hell, and stood before Jesus Christ himself. What he showed me was so urgent and so powerful that he sent me back to share it. If you've ever doubted the reality of the afterlife, if you've ever wondered what happens when we take our final breath, then please listen carefully. For over 40 years, I had served as a pastor in Nashville, Tennessee, preaching the Word of God with everything in me. My church was my home, my life's work, and my greatest joy. But as the years went by, something began happening to me. Something I never expected. At first, it was small things. Forgetting names, misplacing sermon notes, losing track of conversations. But then it got worse. I would stand in front of my congregation, open my mouth to speak, and suddenly, my mind would go blank. The very words I had spent decades preaching just vanished. I tried to brush it off as aging, but my wife, Rebecca, saw it differently. She noticed how often I repeated myself, how I would forget entire conversations we had just hours before. One night, as we sat in our living room, she reached for my hand and said, "Michael, something's not right. We need to see a doctor." I didn't want to admit it, but deep down I knew she was right. After weeks of tests and anxious waiting, the diagnosis finally came: Alzheimer's disease. In that moment, my entire world fell apart. How could I continue preaching if my own mind was betraying me? I had spent my life serving God, and now I was left wondering, why was he letting this happen to me? The days that followed were some of the hardest of my life. I tried to keep preaching and tried to push through, but the more I fought, the more I struggled. The words wouldn't come. I would stand at the pulpit, my congregation watching, waiting, and I would forget what I was saying mid-sentence. I felt humiliated, ashamed, and worst of all, alone. My church family was kind, reassuring me that they understood, but inside, I felt like a failure. I was supposed to be a teacher of God's Word, yet my own mind was betraying me. Why would God allow this? Why would he take away the very gift he had given me to serve him? Then came the day that everything changed. It was a quiet afternoon, and I was sitting in my favorite chair by the window, staring down at my open Bible. The words blurred together, my thoughts foggy, as they so often were these days. But this time was different. A wave of dizziness came over me, stronger than ever before. My vision darkened, and I felt myself slipping away. I tried to call for Rebecca, but the words never left my lips. Before I even knew what was happening, everything went black. The next thing I remember was silence. A deep, overwhelming silence, unlike anything I had ever known. I didn't feel pain, fear, or confusion. In fact, I felt lighter than I had in years. My body was no longer weak. My mind was no longer clouded. And then I saw something that sent chills through me. I was floating above my own body. I could see Rebecca rushing into the room, her face pale with panic. I saw her drop to her knees beside me, shaking me, screaming my name. Moments later, the paramedics arrived, their voices urgent as they worked desperately to revive me. But I knew the truth. I was gone. At that moment, I should have felt terrified. I should have been desperate to get back into my body, to hold Rebecca's hand, to tell her I was still here. But I wasn't afraid. Instead, I was overwhelmed by a deep sense of peace. A peace unlike anything I had ever felt in my entire life. It was as if every burden, every worry, every ounce of suffering had been lifted from me. My illness, my fears, my doubts, they were gone. I wasn't just watching my body from above. I was being pulled away from it. Then I saw it. A light, not just any light. A light so powerful, so warm, so alive that it seemed to call my very soul. It wasn't blinding or harsh. It was inviting, like stepping into the arms of someone who had been waiting for me my whole life. And then, in the midst of that light, I heard a voice so strong, yet so full of love, that it resonated through every part of me. Michael, you are not alone. The moment I heard those words, something inside me broke. Every doubt, every fear, every moment of questioning why God had allowed me to suffer vanished. I knew without a doubt who was speaking to me. I was standing in the presence of Jesus Christ. I can't begin to describe what it felt like to be in his presence. Jesus wasn't just standing before me, he surrounded me. His very being radiated a love so pure, so overwhelming, that I felt completely exposed, yet at the same time more accepted than I had ever been in my entire life. I wanted to speak, to fall at his feet, to tell him how unworthy I was, but before I could say a word, he smiled at me. "You have carried much on your shoulders, Michael," he said. His voice filled with both power and tenderness. "You have served faithfully, even in your struggles." The moment he spoke, I felt something inside me begin to crumble. For years, I had struggled, questioning why my body and mind were failing me. I had begged God for answers, for healing, for some kind of explanation. And now, standing before Jesus, I realized he had never abandoned me. Tears streamed down my face as I finally found the words. "Lord, I tried," I whispered, my voice shaking. I tried to be faithful, but I failed. I doubted. I grew tired. And then my mind, it betrayed me. My heart ached as I said it. I had spent my life preaching about faith, about trusting God no matter the circumstance. But when my own trials came, I had doubted him. I had questioned his plan. I had felt forgotten. But Jesus, he had never forgotten me. Jesus took a step closer, and the light around him seemed to grow even warmer. There was no anger in his eyes, no disappointment, only love. Then he spoke again, and his words cut straight to my soul. "Your illness was not a punishment, Michael," he said gently. "Even in your weakness, I carried you." The moment he said it, I felt every weight, every moment of guilt, every question I had ever had fall away. How many times had I sat in my chair, staring at my Bible, wondering why God would allow this to happen to me? How many times had I felt like I was failing my congregation, my wife, my family? But now, standing before Jesus, I understood. I had never been alone, not once. Then his expression grew serious. The warmth of his presence remained, but there was an urgency in his voice that made my heart tremble. "My people have lost their way," he said. "They sing songs, they recite prayers, they follow traditions, but their hearts are far from me." As soon as he spoke those words, visions appeared before me. I saw churches filled with people. Some raised their hands in worship, their voices loud, their prayers polished. But as I looked closer, I saw their minds were elsewhere. Some were distracted. Some were just going through the motions. Others were consumed by their own doubts, fears, and self-righteousness. Then Jesus showed me something different. I saw a woman, alone in her room, weeping as she cried out to God. I saw a child, whispering a song of praise as he lay in bed. I saw a man, kneeling in an empty field, his head bowed in silent surrender. And unlike the others, these people glowed with a light that seemed to reach into heaven itself. "Do you see?" Jesus asked, turning to me. "True worship is not about performance. It is about presence. It is about being with me, trusting in my love, and letting that trust guide your life." I felt my chest tighten as his words sank in. I had spent years leading worship, years preaching sermons on faith and devotion. But how often have I stopped truly be with him? How often had I let myself rest in his love, rather than striving to prove my faithfulness? I stood there, overwhelmed, as Jesus' words echoed in my soul. How had we drifted so far? How had worship become a routine rather than a relationship? How had prayer become a checklist rather than a conversation with the living God? My heart ached as I realized the truth. So many people, including myself, had been missing the point. Then Jesus raised his hand, and the vision before me changed. I saw people praying not with faith but with empty words. Some were reciting prayers out of habit, their lips moving while their minds were elsewhere. Others were bargaining with God, treating him like a business transaction. "Lord, if you do this for me, I'll do this for you." Then I saw people who were too ashamed to pray at all, believing they weren't good enough to come before God. Jesus turned to me, his face filled with sorrow. "They have forgotten what prayer truly is," he said. "Prayer is not a ritual. It is a lifeline. It is the bridge between heaven and earth. But too many come to me with fear, guilt, or performance, rather than trust." Then he showed me something that broke me. It was a vision of himself, kneeling in the Garden of Gethsemane. I could feel his agony, his desperation, his surrender as he prayed to the Father on the night before his crucifixion. This was prayer. It wasn't about getting what we want. It was about aligning our hearts with the will of God. "This," Jesus said, his voice firm but filled with love, "is what you must tell them. Teach them to pray, not with empty words, but from the depths of their hearts. Teach them to seek me not just in church, but in the quiet places where no one is watching. Teach them that I am not a distant God, but a loving Savior who longs for relationship with them." I nodded, tears streaming down my face. I understood now. This wasn't just a message. It was a calling. As I stood before him, my heart felt like it would burst from the weight of what I had seen. I wanted to cry out, to fall at his feet, to beg for another chance. Not just for myself, but for all those who had lost sight of what truly mattered. We had been so focused on rituals, traditions, and routines that we had forgotten the very heart of faith, Jesus himself. Then, suddenly, the light around us dimmed. A heaviness filled the air, and I felt an unseen force pulling at me, dragging me away from the warmth of his presence. The peace that had surrounded me moments ago was gone. I turned to Jesus, my voice shaking. "Lord, what is happening?" Before he could answer, I was no longer standing in the presence of light. Instead, I was in a place so dark, so suffocating, that I felt my soul tremble. This was hell. Unlike heaven, where everything was alive with beauty and love, hell felt like a place of complete separation. From joy, from peace, from God Himself. I saw them, the ones who had rejected Him. Their faces were filled with regret, torment, and despair as they reached out, crying for mercy that would never come. Their screams echoed through the darkness, not just screams of pain, but of sorrow, of realizing too late that they had chosen this. I fell to my knees, shaking. Lord, why? Why would anyone choose this? Then I heard His voice again, but this time it was filled with sorrow. I have given humanity free will. My love cannot be forced, it must be chosen. And many refuse it. They cling to their own ways, their own understanding, shutting me out until it is too late. I couldn't hold back my tears. How many times had I seen people turn away from God, thinking they had more time? How many had hardened their hearts, rejecting His grace without realizing what was at stake? Then I felt Jesus' presence surround me once more, pulling me back from the darkness. As He lifted me from that place of despair, His voice became urgent. Michael, time is short. Many of my people are distracted. They must return to me before it is too late. As Jesus pulled me from the depths of that terrible place, I felt the weight of eternity pressing on me. The contrast between heaven and hell was unbearable. One filled with joy, love, and the presence of God. The other consumed by darkness, regret, and separation. I wanted to look away, to forget what I had seen, but I knew I couldn't. This was real, and this was final. Jesus turned to me, His eyes filled with both sorrow and urgency. "This is why I am sending you back, Michael," He said. "Not to live for yourself, but to warn them, to teach them, to remind them that I am calling them back before it is too late." The weight of His words hit me like a storm. How could I go back? How could I explain what I had seen? Would anyone even believe me? My voice trembled as I spoke. "Lord, what if they don't listen?" Jesus' expression softened, and He reached out, placing His hand on my shoulder. "You don't have to be strong enough," He said. "My strength is made perfect in weakness. Trust me. I have healed your soul, and I will heal your body. You are not alone." At that moment, I felt something shift within me. The fear, the doubt, the uncertainty, they faded, because I knew the truth now. This wasn't about me. It was about Him, about the world, about souls that were lost, waiting, desperately needing to hear the truth. Then, everything around me began to fade. The light of heaven grew dim, and I felt myself being pulled away, back, back, back. The last thing I heard was Jesus' voice, firm and full of love. "Go, Michael. Tell them what you have seen." Suddenly, I felt myself falling. The warmth of heaven, the presence of Jesus, the overwhelming peace. It all faded away in an instant. I was being pulled back into the world I had left behind. A deep pressure filled my chest, like I was being forced through a narrow passage. And then, I gasped for air. I opened my eyes to the sound of machines beeping and muffled voices. The harsh glow of hospital lights burned my vision, and as I struggled to focus, I saw Rebecca, my wife. Her face was streaked with tears, her hands covering her mouth in shock. "Michael," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Oh my God, you're awake." Doctors and nurses rushed into the room, their faces a mix of awe and confusion. They bombarded me with questions, shining lights in my eyes, checking monitors, calling out vitals. But I barely heard them. My mind was flooded with the reality of what had just happened. I had stood before Jesus. I had seen heaven and hell. I had been sent back. Then, something even more shocking happened. As the doctors checked my reflexes, tested my speech, and reviewed my charts, their expressions shifted from concern to disbelief. One of them, a middle-aged man with tired eyes, shook his head and murmured, This is impossible." Rebecca looked at him desperately. What's impossible?" The doctor hesitated, flipping through my medical records. Finally, he looked up at us, his voice unsteady. "Your husband was in the advanced stages of Alzheimer's disease." He took a deep breath, as if even he couldn't believe what he was saying. "But now, there's no sign of it. It's gone. Completely. Like it never existed." The room fell silent. No one spoke. No one moved. The only sound was the rhythmic beeping of the monitors beside me. Rebecca's eyes widened as she turned back to me, searching my face for answers. "Michael, is this true? Do you remember?" I looked at her, and for the first time in years, there was no fog, no confusion, no struggle to find the words. I remembered everything. The sermons I had forgotten, the conversations I had lost, the faces of my congregation, my family, my children. But more than anything, I remembered Jesus. I remembered his voice, his presence, his warning. Slowly, I nodded. "Yes," I whispered, my voice stronger than it had been in years. "I remember everything." The doctor continued shaking his head, flipping through my charts as if the answers were hidden somewhere in the pages. This doesn't happen." We ran every test. The scans showed significant deterioration in the brain. "Alzheimer's doesn't just go away." He looked at me, his face filled with both confusion and something else, something close to fear. "Mr. Anderson, this is beyond medical explanation." I knew what it was. I felt his hand on me. I had heard his promise. "You are healed." Tears streamed down Rebecca's face as she pressed her forehead against my hand. "It's a miracle," she whispered, and she was right. But that wasn't the biggest miracle. The real miracle was the message I had been sent back to deliver. I took a deep breath, feeling the strength return to my body. A body that had been broken, a mind that had been fading. But now I was whole again, not just physically but spiritually, because I had been given a mission. I turned to Rebecca, squeezing her hand. "I have to tell them." She wiped her tears, looking at me with confusion. "Tell who? About what?" I swallowed hard. How could I even begin to explain? How could I describe standing before Jesus, feeling the weight of eternity in his words? How could I make people believe? So I told her everything. I told her how I had left my body, how I had seen the paramedics working on me, how I had felt the pull of something far greater than this world. I told her how I had seen Jesus Christ himself, how he had looked into my soul with love and truth, and how he had shown me the state of his people. I told her about the churches filled with empty worship, about the people who prayed out of routine instead of relationship. I told her about heaven. So beautiful, so full of life and peace, the place we were meant to be. And then I told her about hell. Rebecca sat frozen, her hand covering her mouth. She was hanging on to every word, tears running down her face. "Michael," she whispered, "you saw all of that?" I nodded, my throat tight. "And Jesus gave me a message." She leaned closer, her fingers gripping mine. "What did he say?" I took a shaky breath, hearing his voice so clearly in my mind. He said time is short, that his people have turned away, that they must return to him before it's too late. Rebecca covered her face and sobbed. She knew it was true. Rebecca's sobs filled the room, her shoulders shaking as she tried to take in everything I had just told her. I could see the conflict in her eyes. Part of her was overwhelmed, struggling to believe what I had seen. But deep down, she knew. She knew that this wasn't just a dream, that it wasn't just a hallucination from being unconscious. This was real. She wiped her eyes and looked at me, her voice trembling. "Michael, what are you going to do?" I exhaled slowly, my heart pounding in my chest. "I have to tell them." My voice was steady now. "I have to tell the world what I saw, what Jesus showed me. This isn't just for me. It's for everyone." Rebecca reached for my hands, gripping them tightly. "Then you can't wait. You have to start now." Just then, a nurse walked into the room, stopping in her tracks when she saw me awake, sitting up, fully aware. The shock on her face was unmistakable. She had seen my condition. She had probably assumed I wouldn't wake up. And if I did, I certainly wouldn't be like this. I could see the curiosity in her eyes, but also hesitation. She didn't know if she should say it, if she should acknowledge the miracle that had just unfolded before her. So I spoke first. "I know what you're thinking." My voice was stronger than it had been in years. "And you're right. I shouldn't be here. But I am." She stepped closer, swallowing hard. "Mr. Anderson, She hesitated. "We weren't expecting this. Your condition, your tests. This doesn't make sense." I smiled. "No, it doesn't." I could feel his presence still with me. I could still hear his voice in my heart. "But I know exactly why I'm here." The nurse's eyes widened slightly, and I could see the battle in her mind. Logic fighting against faith. She wanted to believe, but everything she had been taught told her that what was happening was impossible. She glanced at the monitor beside my bed, as if searching for answers in the blinking numbers, then back at me. "Mr. Anderson, we ran every test. Your condition was advanced. There was no hope of reversal." She hesitated, her voice quieter now. "And yet, here you are." I nodded, feeling a peace settle over me. Here I am. But not because of medicine, not because of science. I looked straight into her eyes, my words steady. Because I met Jesus Christ. I stood before him, and he sent me back with a message. Her lips parted slightly, and I could see the conflict in her face. Doubt and wonder mixed together. She glanced at Rebecca, who still held my hand tightly, her tear-streaked face filled with nothing but certainty. Finally, the nurse swallowed hard and whispered, "What message?" I took a deep breath. "That time is short." She furrowed her brows, confused. "What do you mean?" I held her gaze, my heart pounding as I spoke the words that had been burning inside me since the moment I woke up. People think they have more time. They go to church, They pray, they go through the motions, but their hearts are far from Him. Jesus showed me, He showed me how many have turned away, how distracted they've become. He showed me heaven, and He showed me hell. I paused, gripping Rebecca's hand even tighter, and He told me to warn them, to tell them to come back before it's too late. The nurse just stood there, completely still. I could see her processing everything, but before she could respond, the door to my hospital room swung open. 2 doctors walked in, one of them holding a clipboard, the other staring at me like he had just seen a ghost. I recognized him. He was the same doctor who had told my wife that my condition was irreversible. He stopped at the foot of my bed, flipping through my chart, shaking his head as if the answers would magically appear in front of him. "Mr. Anderson," he exhaled, rubbing his forehead. I don't even know what to say. Medically speaking, this is impossible." He looked at me, his expression unreadable. "But here you are, awake, talking," and he hesitated, then finally admitted it. "And you are completely healed." Rebecca let out a shaky breath beside me, fresh tears running down her cheeks. I looked at the doctor and said the only thing that mattered. Not impossible. A miracle. The doctor stared at me, his mouth slightly open, as if he wanted to argue, but he couldn't. There was no medical explanation for what had happened. The tests, the scans, the years of cognitive decline, it was all gone. My mind was clear. My body was strong. I was fully healed. He cleared his throat and glanced at the other doctor beside him, who looked just as shaken. "We'll need to run more tests," he muttered, flipping through my file as if the answers could somehow appear between the lines. But we all knew the truth. There was no test in the world that could explain this. Rebecca squeezed my hand, her breath still uneven from crying. I turned to her, then back to the nurse who had asked about my message. Her expression had changed. She was no longer just a medical professional observing a strange case. She was a person wrestling with the reality of what she had just heard. I looked straight at her and said, "You wanted to know the message Jesus gave me?" I took a deep breath, feeling the weight of his words in my heart. He told me to warn them that time is running out, that people have turned away from him, filling their lives with distractions, pride, and empty worship, that so many think they have more time, but they don't. The nurse's face paled, and she swallowed hard. "What do you mean?" she whispered. I hesitated, knowing that the next words I spoke were the most important. "I saw hell." My voice was steady, but the memory sent a chill through me. I heard their screams. I saw the regret, the torment, not because God didn't love them, but because they had rejected him, because they chose themselves instead of surrendering to his grace. I paused, watching as her hands trembled slightly. Jesus showed me how many people are heading down that path without even realizing it. Tears welled in her eyes, but she quickly blinked them away. She opened her mouth to say something, but no words came. The doctors shifted uncomfortably, exchanging uncertain glances. I could tell they didn't know what to do with this. They had just witnessed something miraculous, something unexplainable. But to accept my words meant accepting the reality of God. And that was something science had no answer for. The lead doctor cleared his throat and finally spoke. "Mr. Anderson, whatever happened to you? It's beyond anything we've ever seen." He hesitated. "You should be dead." And even if you had survived, you should still be suffering from Alzheimer's. But you're not. He exhaled slowly. I don't know what happened to you, but I can't deny that something did. I met his gaze and said firmly, "You don't have to understand it, doctor. But you need to know this, it was Jesus. And he is real." The room was silent. No one spoke. No one moved. The weight of what I had just said hung in the air like a thick fog, pressing down on everyone. The doctors, the nurse, even Rebecca. They were all caught between what they knew to be true and what they had just witnessed with their own eyes. The lead doctor finally exhaled, rubbing his forehead like he was trying to push away the reality of what was happening. I don't know what to say," he admitted. "This goes against everything I've ever learned, everything I've ever believed." I nodded slowly. "I understand. I was a preacher for 40 years, and even I struggled to believe what I saw. But I'm telling you," I paused, feeling my voice tighten. "It's real. Heaven is real. Hell is real. And Jesus, he's calling us back to him before it's too late." Rebecca wiped her face, still trying to take it all in. "Michael, you said Jesus sent you back with a mission. What now? What are you supposed to do?" I turned to her, then looked at the doctors, the nurse, and finally out the small window of my hospital room, where the sun was starting to rise. A new day, a second chance. I took a deep breath. "I have to tell the world." Rebecca's hand trembled in mine. "How?" I looked into her eyes, the fire inside me growing stronger. "I don't know yet, but I won't stop until I do." The doctors stayed quiet, unable to process everything, but I could tell the seed had been planted. Even if they weren't ready to accept the truth, they had witnessed it. And deep down, something had shifted in them. They would never be the same. The nurse took a shaky breath, then whispered something I wasn't expecting. "Mr. Anderson, do you think there's still time for me?" I felt my throat tighten. "There's still time for everyone," I told her. "But Jesus made it clear time is short. Don't wait." She nodded slowly, then turned and walked out of the room, her head down as she processed everything. The doctors followed, murmuring to each other as they left. Finally, it was just me and Rebecca. She turned to me, her expression filled with both awe and fear. "Michael, I believe you, and I'll be with you every step of the way. But are you ready for this?" I squeezed her hand, my mind flashing back to the last thing Jesus had said to me. "Go, Michael. Tell them what you have seen." I looked at my wife, the woman who had stood by me through my worst days, through my sickness, through my death, and now through my return. I smiled. "I have to be, because this isn't about me anymore." I looked back out the window at the rising sun. This is about saving souls. If you're watching this right now, this message is for you. I don't know where you stand in your faith, but please don't wait. Jesus showed me the truth. Heaven and hell are real, and time is shorter than we think. If you've felt far from God, if you've been caught up in distractions, if you've been going through the motions, this is your wake-up call. Come back to Him. Seek Him with your whole heart. And if you don't know where to start, just pray. Right now, say, "Jesus, I don't want to wait anymore. I want to know you. I want to follow you." If this testimony spoke to you, share it. Tell your family, your friends, anyone who needs to hear it, because the time is now. Subscribe to this channel for more true testimonies like this one, and let us all share the love we have for our God. Jesus is calling. Will you answer?